This is Lecture 2 from Chapter 2, The Constitution of American Government Roots and Reform from PLS 211 U.S. Government 1 with Rappahannock Community College and your instructor, Matt Brent. So here is our first attempt at actually creating a government. While many people just assume that the Constitution has always been our government, the fact is it wasn't. We actually started out with something called the Articles of Confederation. You see, Britain didn't, and still does not, have a written constitution. The colonists, however, wanted a constitution. They wanted a written document that actually defined their rights and the obligations of government, and the limits put upon the government. This had never been done before, and it was accomplished during a war against the largest military power in the entire world. The colonists created a loose league of friendship under what we call the Articles of Confederation. The only way the colonists could have devised a system less like the British unitary system would be if they had chosen anarchy, which is the lack of any government at all. In a confederacy, the government is very weak, and it's made up of parts, which we call states, that have a majority of the power and the sovereignty. This is almost the opposite of the unitary system used in Britain, in which all of the power and the sovereignty is vested in the central government. The Articles of Confederation, which is also found in your textbook, was predominantly a reaction to the British rule in many other ways as well. So here are some key provisions of the Articles. First, each state had independence and sovereignty, which was their ultimate authority to govern within their borders and in their territory. 2. The national government and the national legislature would have power to coin money, make peace, appoint officers to the military, run the post office, and negotiate with Indian tribes. 3. Each state in the Congress would have an equal vote. 4. A supermajority, which is 9 out of 13 colonies or states, was required to pass any laws, and all amendments to the Articles had to be unanimous. And finally, the fifth key was that members of Congress would actually be chosen and paid for by the states and the legislatures of those states. The Articles were ratified in 1781 and had been operational throughout the Revolutionary War. However, after the British surrendered and the people were no longer united in war, problems started to manifest. So let's look at what some of those problems are. As I already mentioned, the central government under the Articles was to be weak. The National Congress was empowered to make peace, coin money, appoint officers, control the post office, and negotiate with the Indians. And that's pretty much it. The states retained independence and sovereignty, and therefore each state, regardless of the size of the state, had but one vote in the Congress. To further limit the government's powers, 9 of the 13 states were necessary to pass any measure, and complete unanimous votes were required to amend the Articles. The requirements for supermajorities for even simple legislation guaranteed the continuing preeminence of the states over the central government. Delegates to the Congress were chosen by the state legislatures, further ensuring the states' rights, and because they were fearful of a new king, the Articles made no provision for an executive branch and assumed that a federal judiciary was just not needed. The states could theoretically handle all those functions. By 1784, Congress had some trouble getting a quorum of the 9 states to actually conduct business. Even when a quorum was made, the states did nothing but fight. The Congress faced a pretty serious problem. They had to raise money to pay for the Revolutionary War debt, but they had no power to tax. States coined their own money, and trade wars started to occur. Congress had no power at all to regulate commerce among the states or ensure a unified monetary system. Although Congress could coin money, continental dollars were worth little because the government had nothing to back it up with. States conducted foreign relations without regard to the neighboring states or their wants. Duties, tariffs, and taxes on trade proliferated with different ones in each state. Vermont threatened to annex itself to Canada, and border wars between the states began. So, in summary, we could talk about some of the weaknesses of the Articles. And here they are in this chart. If you look under the column for Congress, well, they had no power to tax, which meant they couldn't get any money. They had no power to regulate interstate or foreign commerce. They had no power to coin money. And they had no power to regulate tariffs. Well, there really was no executive branch, so that was an issue in and of itself, and so they had no one to implement the laws. They had no one to coordinate foreign policy, because each state could do its own thing, and no one was really available to help ensure that we were actually following the Treaty of Paris. Similarly, we didn't have a judicial branch either. So the states, had issues deciding borders. If, for example, Maryland and Virginia got into a tiff, which state's court would handle the problem? Well, that is a problem in and of itself. So there's no one to really handle any of the disputes, including the trade disputes. But the issue that really kicked it all in the head was Shays' Rebellion. Before the convention could meet, unrest broke out in America. In Massachusetts, banks were foreclosing on farms in Massachusetts, and the legislature enacted a new law requiring that all debts be paid in cash. Daniel Shays, who happened to be a Revolutionary War veteran, was pretty ticked off, and he was frustrated with the new law and the huge debt burden of his farmer friends. He led a group of 1,500 armed and disgruntled farmers to the Capitol in Springfield. They forcibly prevented the state court from foreclosing on the farms, and Congress authorized the Secretary of War to call up a national militia to respond and appropriated $530,000 for that purpose. Every state except Virginia refused. Finally, a private army put down Shays' Rebellion. The failure of Congress to protect the citizens and the property of Americans was just the kicker that proved that the Articles of Confederation were just too weak to survive. As we start talking about the Miracle at Philadelphia, specifically with the writing of the United States Constitution, I wanted to take a moment and point out one of the videos I had listed in Blackboard that I recommend. Of course, you don't have to watch it, but there's a movie called A More Perfect Union, which is basically the story of the creation of the Constitution from the standpoint of James Madison. And it's actually pretty good, so check that out if you can find it. Okay, so on February 21st, 1787, Congress had called for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, end quote. Well, we know from history that that's not exactly what they did, but they got away with it. At this convention, every state sent a delegate except for Rhode Island. Of those men, they were farmers, businessmen, intellectuals, and politicians. 29 of them total. They're all respected members of their state communities, and basically all of them were pretty well known at the time. They chose George Washington to preserve over the convention because of his renown from his service in the war, and basically he was a great leader. When the Virginia delegation at the convention suggested that they just throw out the Articles altogether and come up with a new system of government, the delegates realized that what they were possibly doing could be considered treason, so together they decided to adopt a stance of secrecy so that no one would actually find out what they were doing. When we look at the characteristics and the motives of the framers, well, we're kind of limited in what we know because obviously we weren't there. We are able to read what they've written, but we were not there, and that's very important. So a lot of this is up to interpretation. So at this convention, eventually, there are 74 delegates selected for the convention. 55 ultimately make it to Philadelphia, and they're often referred to as the Framers or the Founding Fathers. Most of them are quite young, although Ben Franklin was 81 years old, so he was by far the oldest. And these men represented a vast amount of experience. They were, and still are, numerous debates about the motives of the framers, just as I mentioned. They have been accused of being a group of self-serving elitists out to protect their own vested interests. But the framers themselves asserted they were trying to preserve the nation, and this debate is still raging among political scientists and historians. One of the most significant things about this convention are the different plans that are brought up. And you see here on the screen the Virginia and the New Jersey plans. These are perhaps the most important, with the exception of the Connecticut Compromise, which we'll talk about in a moment. Um, there's a bunch of different conflicts in the states in the years of the early republic. Um, we saw some of the problems with that leading up to Shays' Rebellion and how the Articles of Confederation just didn't work. But among these were conflicts and interests between the large and the small states. There were also conflicts between the predominantly agricultural South and the industrial North, and between the slave states and the free states. Virginia, which is large, populous, agricultural, and slave owning at the time, presented the first plan for a new government, and basically in doing so, it set the agenda for this convention. The Virginia plan proposed that sovereignty be vested in the people and not the states. This would benefit states with large populations since they would have more sovereignty because they have more people. They advocated a powerful central government with three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch was to be bicameral, which means two houses, with one house directly elected and the other appointed by the state legislature, but both would be proportional to the population of the state. The small states were more satisfied with the Articles and its guarantees of equal status for the small states. They proposed the New Jersey plan that primarily would strengthen the Articles by giving Congress the ability to raise revenues from duties and a post office and retaining a unicameral legislature chosen by the state legislatures. As I mentioned, the Connecticut Compromise is really important. Sometimes it's referred to as the Great Compromise. But what we see here is essentially a merger of the two plans, the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. The most serious disagreements were the conflicts between the large and the small states over representation in Congress, and the argument between North and South on the issue of slavery. The question of slavery dealt with whether and how slaves were supposed to be counted in population figures and how slaves would be dealt with for taxation purposes. Connecticut was the state which offered the compromise, and it took elements from both the Virginia plan, which was for large states, and the New Jersey plan, which was for small states. The legislature would be bicameral, again, two houses, with the lower house, the House of Representatives, based on population, and the upper house, the Senate, based on equal representation for the states. The House, as the more representative body, would originate all bills having to do with money. Both houses had to pass all legislation, so both small and large states were satisfied. Southern states didn't want the northern states to interfere in the lucrative cotton trade. The proposal of a tax on the importation of slaves was severely contested by the South. This brought up the issue of slavery. In order to gain the acquiescence of the North to continue the slave trade for another 20 years, and for a 20-year ban on taxing cotton exports, Southerners agreed to allow the national government to regulate commerce and for the Senate to pass treaties with a two-thirds majority vote. They also agreed to navigation laws being subjected to a simple majority vote. This left the problem of how to determine the population of the states. The slave states wanted slaves counted for the purpose of representation. Of course, they wouldn't receive the right to vote, but they would just serve essentially as a number on a piece of paper. And the free states didn't really like that, because then the slave states would have more votes than the free states. So they compromised again by deciding that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person. In other words, for every 5 slaves, they would count as 3 people, and that became known as the 3/5 compromise. What we have left is to deal with the other branches of government, specifically the executive branch. The framers had to decide on what to do with the executive branch. How many people should be involved in it, how much power it should have, things like that. The most controversial decision was the term of office for the executive and how to pick the person. They were afraid of tyranny because, After all, they had just fought a war against the English king. As one of my professors always used to joke, we just got rid of one King George. We didn't want another one. Um, so they were afraid that if the executive branch was too strong, it would be similar to King George. They were also afraid of direct election of an executive because, quite frankly, they didn't trust people. After Shays' rebellion, they were kind of wary of the power of the masses. So again, we have a conflict between the influence of the large and the small states. The Committee on Unfinished Portions was tasked with finding a compromise. They ended up choosing a 4-year term of office with the possibility for that individual to be reelected, and they created something called the Electoral College that would give states a role in the selection of the president and limit the influences on the masses. In addition, the committee devised a method of impeaching and removing the president. Again, both the House and the Senate got separate roles for this to ensure the interests of both the large and the small states. So let's review. Here on the screen is a brief summary of the plans presented in Philadelphia. As you can see, when in terms of legislature, Virginia plan wanted it bicameral, they wanted 2 houses, whereas the New Jersey plan wanted 1 house. And through the compromise, we ended up with 2, which we have today, the House of Representatives and the Senate. In terms of representation, Virginia, being the larger state, wanted population as the basis for representation, but New Jersey, being a smaller state, wanted us to be equal. So, through compromise, we do a little bit of both. The House of Representatives is based on population, where the upper house, the Senate, is not. It's based on equality, and every state has 2 senators. For the executive branch, the Virginia plan actually did not determine the number of executives, but they did decide that they would be chosen by the legislature. The New Jersey plan wanted several different executives. So imagine, rather than 1 president, having, say, 5. But they also put in a provision where those people could be removed if the states chose to remove them. So through compromise, they ended up selecting a single executive, and so we have 1 president, and that president is chosen by the Electoral College. For the judicial branch, the Virginia plan wanted life tenure, and they wanted to give these judges the ability to veto state legislation. The New Jersey plan didn't really give any power to the judicial branch to enact or veto legislation of the states. They really limited their power. So what the compromise does is give the court jurisdiction over interstate conflict. So if Maryland is having a problem with Virginia, that's interstate conflict, and the judicial branch can step in. And we'll talk about that more when we get to a chapter on the judicial branch. In terms of ratification, the Virginia plan suggested it being ratified by the people, whereas the New Jersey plan chose to ratify it by the states. The compromise decided, hey, let's have a special convention in each state where the people can come and vote. In terms of representation, who actually presented the plan, not the representation in the Senate or the House. From Virginia, we have 2 very important people, Edmund Randolph and James Madison. James Madison, of course, is probably the most famous of all these people. New Jersey was presented by William Patterson, and the Connecticut Compromise was presented by Roger Sherman. And with that, we conclude this lecture.